When Julia and her husband Michael decided to move from the noise of the city into a small town tucked between wooded hills and winding roads, they thought they were making the best decision of their lives. The town of Crestwood promised peace, safety, and a chance for their young daughter, Emily, to grow up in a place where neighbors still waved at each other. The drive into town had been pleasant enough. Rows of weathered farmhouses, fading signs from forgotten businesses, and long stretches of untouched forest. But Julia couldn't help noticing how few cars shared the road with them. It was late summer, yet the air already felt heavy, almost too still, as though the entire town were holding its breath. Their new house sat on the edge of town, where paved streets dissolved into gravel paths. It was an old colonial home, its white paint peeling in places, shutters hanging slightly crooked, but something about its quiet dignity had drawn Julia in from the first listing she saw. Inside, the floors creaked with every step, and the air carried the faint smell of wood smoke and dust. Emily darted through the rooms excitedly, her laughter bouncing against the bare walls, while Michael carried in boxes with the efficiency of someone eager to get settled. Julia tried to ignore the chill she felt when she first stepped through the doorway, a prickle running down her arms as though she had entered a room where someone had just been standing. That night, after hours of unpacking and setting up the bare essentials, Julia found herself alone in the kitchen while Michael tucked Emily into bed. The windows rattled lightly with the evening wind, and the single bulb overhead cast a yellowish glow that barely pushed back the shadows in the corners. She thought she heard footsteps on the gravel outside, deliberate and slow, but when she looked out, the street was empty, bathed in the pale glow of a single lamppost. She lingered at the window a little longer, unease prickling at the back of her neck, before she shook her head and returned to cleaning up. It was just the newness of the house, she told herself. Her nerves always did this when she moved somewhere unfamiliar later. When Julia finally climbed into bed, she noticed how quiet the neighborhood was. Not the peaceful kind of quiet she had been expecting, but the sort of silence that pressed against the ears until it became uncomfortable. There were no crickets, no distant dogs barking, no cars rolling by. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of an old clock in the hall, marking each second with an almost mocking patience. She closed her eyes, trying to let herself drift, but the longer she lay there, the more she became convinced that she could hear something else beneath the silence, an irregular thump, like someone walking across the wooden floors of the downstairs living room. She nearly nudged Michael awake, but then the sound stopped. She told herself it must have been the house settling, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Around 3 in the morning, Julia woke again, this time to the unmistakable sound of Emily's bedroom door creaking open. She sat up immediately, heart pounding, and called softly for her daughter. No answer. Slipping out of bed, she padded down the hall to Emily's room, only to find the girl sound asleep, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. The door was half open, swaying gently as though it had been touched just moments before. Julia pulled it shut and turned to head back, but for the briefest instant, she thought she saw something shift in the darkness at the far end of the hallway, a shadow darker than the rest, retreating just as her eyes focused on it. Her throat tightened, but when she blinked, the hallway was empty. Still, she left the light on for the rest of the night. Morning came too quickly. Julia had barely slept, her thoughts replaying the creak of Emily's door and that strange, suffocating silence in the house. Yet when the first light pushed its way through the curtains, everything seemed harmless again, almost laughable, as though the fears of the night had been nothing more than her imagination. Michael was already in the kitchen, cheerful in that way only he could be after a good night's rest. Emily sat at the table eating cereal, giggling at some joke her father made. Julia smiled despite herself, but her eyes kept drifting to the windows, scanning the empty street beyond. They spent the late morning walking into town. Crestwood was charming on the surface, a main street lined with brick buildings, faded shop signs, and a single diner with a neon light that flickered every few seconds. The sidewalks were cracked, and many of the storefronts looked like they hadn't seen much business in years, but Julia reminded herself that small towns often aged like this. Still, she noticed something unusual, the way the few people they passed seemed to watch them too long. Their gazes weren't hostile, but rather heavy, like they were studying something they weren't sure about. When Julia waved to an elderly woman sweeping her porch, the woman's eyes flickered wide before she quickly turned away. Michael insisted on stopping at the diner for lunch, eager to start blending in. Inside, the smell of coffee and fried food hung in the air, and a radio played an old tune quietly in the background. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with sharp features and tired eyes, greeted them with a polite but strained smile. "You're the new family in the Miller house," she said without asking, as though she had been expecting them. Julia's stomach tightened at the mention of their home. "It's a good place," the waitress continued, though her tone wavered on the word good. Emily chattered happily about pancakes, oblivious to the way her parents exchanged a glance as they ate. Julia noticed that the other patrons, all of them older, had gone quiet. She felt their eyes drift toward her family, then quickly turn away when she looked up. One man in particular, seated at the counter, seemed to linger on them the longest. His face was lined with deep creases, his hands thick and calloused from years of labor. When Julia caught his gaze, he didn't flinch or pretend to look elsewhere. Instead, he gave her the smallest shake of his head, almost imperceptible, before turning back to his coffee. The gesture unsettled her more than outright hostility would have done on the walk back to the house. Julia held Emily's hand a little tighter. The air in Crestwood seemed different now, less quaint, more watchful. Michael tried to reassure her, chalking it up to small-town curiosity, but Julia couldn't shake the thought that their family had already been slotted into some unspoken role in the community. When they reached the gravel path leading to their home, Julia glanced back at the road. For a moment, she thought she saw the man from the diner standing at the far corner, his frame dark against the daylight, just watching them. But when she blinked, the street was empty. By the second night in the house, Julia found herself fighting against the urge to dread nightfall. She busied herself with unpacking until nearly midnight, forcing her focus on the sound of cardboard tearing, books thumping onto shelves, and Emily's soft snores coming from down the hall. Michael had fallen asleep early, leaving her alone in the living room. The old grandfather clock in the hall marked each passing minute with its heavy tick, and though she told herself the sound was comforting, she couldn't shake the sense that the rhythm was listening as much as it was keeping time. Around 1 in the morning, Julia froze mid-step. From the far wall of the living room came a muffled noise, a faint scrape, followed by a whisper so thin she thought she might have imagined it. She held her breath, straining to hear. It came again, more distinct this time, a murmur that almost resembled a word, though she couldn't understand it. Julia pressed her ear closer to the wall, her pulse quickening. The whisper stopped abruptly, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. She backed away, suddenly aware of how the shadows seemed thicker in the corners of the room. The next morning, Julia mentioned the noises to Michael as casually as she could over breakfast. He laughed it off, saying old houses had their quirks, pipes knocking, wood shifting, critters in the walls. "Don't spook yourself, Jules. It's an adventure, right?" he said, flashing his usual reassuring smile. Emily nodded along, but then quietly added, "I heard them too." Julia froze. Emily's tone wasn't playful or dramatic, it was matter of fact. "They were saying my name," the girl whispered, her eyes dropping to her bowl of cereal. Michael ruffled Emily's hair quickly, dismissing it as a dream, but Julia caught the nervous flicker in his eyes. Later that day, Julia stopped by the small grocery store in town. The shelves were half empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the cashier, a thin man with hollow cheeks, watched her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. When Julia asked if the house they had moved into was old, he paused for an unnatural beat before answering. "Old enough," he muttered, sliding her change across the counter without touching her hand. She pressed further, asking if the previous family had lived there long. His jaw tightened. "Not long," he said, before turning away to pretend he had other work. That short exchange echoed in her mind the entire walk home that night. Julia left a lamp on in the hallway outside Emily's room, determined not to let the darkness get the better of her. She dozed lightly, her ears tuned to every creak and sigh of the house. Sometime after midnight, she woke to the sound of footsteps again, slow and deliberate, moving from the living room toward the stairs. Her stomach clenched. This time, she was sure it wasn't the house settling. She sat upright in bed, listening. The footsteps paused at the base of the stairs, and then, Just as the silence threatened to break her resolve, Julia heard her daughter's bedroom door creak open for the second night in a row. Julia barely slept after hearing Emily's door creak open again. When morning finally arrived, she walked through the house with heavy steps, as if the walls themselves were judging her for being afraid. Dust still lingered in corners she hadn't cleaned, and though the sunlight streamed through the windows, the rooms looked oddly gray, like the brightness couldn't fully take hold. She found herself pressing her palm against the living room wall where she'd heard whispers the night before. The wood was cool, almost damp, and for a fleeting second, she thought she felt a faint vibration, like the steady hum of a voice just below the surface. Michael urged her to focus on settling in rather than feeding her paranoia. He suggested they meet more neighbors, so the family wouldn't feel so isolated. Julia reluctantly agreed. In the afternoon, she took Emily into the backyard while Michael tinkered with boxes in the garage. The grass was tall and uneven. The fence half collapsed in places, offering glimpses of the dense woods beyond. Emily wandered to the far edge, where the fence leaned inward and pointed. "Mom," she whispered, "he's back." Julia followed her gaze. At first, she saw nothing, only trees, thick and unmoving in the summer air. But then, between the gaps, she spotted a man standing at the tree line, watching. He was the same figure from the diner, the weathered man with deep creases carved into his face. He stood perfectly still, his posture rigid, his hands at his sides. Even from a distance, Julia felt the weight of his stare. She lifted her arm to wave, trying to make the encounter less menacing, but he did not move, did not acknowledge her. Emily tugged on her sleeve, frightened, and when Julia looked back, the man was gone. No movement, no sound of retreating footsteps, just the empty woods. Julia's chest tightened with unease. That evening, Julia confronted Michael about what she had seen. He brushed it off as a local checking up on them. "Small towns, remember? People know everyone's business," he said. But the way he avoided her eyes made her doubt he believed his own words. Emily remained quiet during dinner, pushing her food around her plate. When Julia finally asked what was wrong, Emily murmured, "He was whispering my name again." Julia's spoon froze midair. She didn't ask her daughter to elaborate, because she was afraid of what Emily might say later that night. Julia stood at the upstairs window, staring out at the tree line. The yard was bathed in moonlight, pale and almost colorless, and every shadow seemed to stretch too far, as if the darkness was reaching for the house. She was about to step back when movement caught her eye. For an instant, she saw him again. The man, standing just beyond the broken section of the fence, his face turned upward toward her window. Her breath hitched, and she stumbled back, nearly knocking over the lamp on the nightstand. When she dared to look again, the yard was empty. Yet she couldn't shake the image of his hollow stare, watching from the edge of her new life. The next morning, Megan convinced herself she'd overreacted. Cruises had security cameras, trained staff, and plenty of people around. Surely she wasn't in any real danger. Still, as she made her way to the breakfast buffet, she couldn't shake the memory of the slow, deliberate knock on her door. The corridor outside her cabin seemed longer than usual, lined with identical doors that gave no hint of the people behind them. Two uniformed crew members passed her, speaking softly in a language she didn't recognize. As they walked by, she noticed one of them glancing over his shoulder at her. Not just a quick glance, but a long, assessing look, as though measuring her reaction. Breakfast should have been a comfort. Sunlight pouring through panoramic windows, the clatter of plates, the smell of coffee and fresh pastries. But Megan's attention kept snagging on small details. A waiter refilling water glasses seemed to be lingering at her table just a beat too long. A young couple at the next table whispered rapidly to each other and kept glancing toward the entrance. And when she finally stood to leave, she caught sight of the man from the night before, the one in the dark suit, seated alone near the back. His hands were folded neatly on the table, his plate untouched. He didn't blink when their eyes met. This time, Megan didn't wait to see if he would vanish. She turned and left. She decided to spend the afternoon exploring the ship. Deck 7 had several quiet lounges and a library that smelled faintly of old paper despite the ocean air. In the library, she struck up a brief conversation with an older British woman named Helen, who was knitting in the corner. When Megan mentioned seeing a man in a dark suit, Helen's needles paused mid-click. Tall, thin, doesn't eat. Helen asked, her voice low. I've seen him too. 3 years ago, on this very ship. Different cruise. He was watching people then as well. Before Megan could ask more, another passenger entered, and Helen's demeanor instantly brightened, as if she hadn't said anything at all. That evening, Megan noticed a change in the ship's atmosphere. The wind picked up, rattling the glass doors on the outer decks. The hallways seemed dimmer, shadows stretching farther than they should. She passed a security camera mounted above the stairwell and had the sudden, irrational feeling that it wasn't connected to anything at all. Back in her cabin, she locked the door and tried to distract herself with a movie on the tiny wall-mounted TV. Halfway through, the screen flickered, briefly showing what looked like live footage of the ship's exterior decks at night. In the grainy image, a lone figure stood at the railing, unmoving, staring out at the sea. She shut off the TV, her heart pounding. The ship's engines throbbed beneath her feet, steady and relentless, but she couldn't shake the growing sense that the ocean majesty wasn't just carrying her across the Caribbean. It was carrying something else, something that didn't belong among the living. Julia couldn't shake Emily's words. That night, after putting her daughter to bed, she sat in the darkened living room with only a small lamp burning. Every creak of the house, every shift in the wood, made her flinch. She strained her ears for the whispers she had heard before, but the silence stretched on, deep and suffocating. Then, faint, almost imperceptible, came the sound of scratching. It wasn't the scurry of a mouse or the hollow pop of settling wood. It was deliberate, like fingers dragging slowly along the inside of the wall. Heart hammering, Julia pressed her palm against the wall where the sound seemed strongest. She could feel the vibration through the old plaster. For a moment, she thought she heard her name breathed faintly, the syllables dissolving into the silence before she could be sure. With trembling hands, she fetched a flashlight from the hall closet and crouched along the baseboards, scanning for cracks or openings. Her beam landed on something near the far corner, scratches etched into the wood, thin and jagged, as though carved by nails from the inside out. The next day, she waited until Michael was out running errands. She didn't want him dismissing her fears again. Armed with a screwdriver, Julia began prying at a loose panel in the hallway near the staircase. Dust rained down as the wood gave way, revealing a narrow, hollow space between the walls. The air that rushed out was foul, tinged with mold and something sour she couldn't place. She gagged, covering her mouth, but pushed her flashlight into the gap. For a split second, the light glinted off something pale and thin, retreating deeper into the shadows. Julia dropped the panel with a scream, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the flashlight too. She forced herself to look again, but the hollow space was empty, just dust, cobwebs, and a tangle of pipes. She replaced the panel quickly, her breath ragged. When Michael returned, she said nothing. That night, however, the house seemed to come alive with new sounds, a shuffle just beyond the walls, faint knocks along the staircase, and soft whispers that seemed to move from room to room, always a step ahead of her. Julia barely slept, clutching Emily close in her bed, her mind repeating the same words. Already inside, in the gray light of dawn, Julia walked the length of the hallway again, her nerves raw. That was when she noticed something new. Along the plaster near Emily's room, faint impressions had appeared overnight, as if fingertips had pressed outward from the other side. 5 distinct marks, too small for Michael's hands, too large for Emily's, ran in a downward streak, dragging toward the baseboard. Julia reached out, her own fingers trembling, and touched the indentations. They were cold. Beneath them, a faint line of dust had been disturbed, as though something had been crawling its way out. By the 7th day in Crestwood, Julia's nerves had worn thin. The impressions in the wall by Emily's door were still there, faint but undeniable. She had tried scrubbing them away, pressing against the plaster with all her weight, but they remained etched like scars. That morning, Michael found her staring at them again, her hands shaking. "Julia," he said softly, "you have to stop doing this to yourself." His tone was calm, almost rehearsed, as though he'd been preparing for this conversation. "There's nothing there. It's an old house creaking, nothing more." Julia snapped. "I saw something in the walls, Michael. Not mice, Not pipes, something. And Emily hears it too. You can't tell me this is all in my head. Her voice cracked, raw with exhaustion. For a moment, Michael's expression wavered, but he shook his head. You're tired, Jules. The move, the stress, it's getting to you. Emily's just repeating what you're feeding her. Julia felt her stomach twist at his words. He truly didn't believe her. Or maybe he didn't want to. That night, Julia lay awake, listening to the now familiar shuffling inside the walls. At one point, she heard a low whisper drift through the cracks near the floorboards. Her name, unmistakable this time. She sat up, heart pounding, but Michael lay fast asleep beside her, oblivious. Julia pressed her hand against the wall and whispered back, "What do you want?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then a faint knock came from the other side, deliberate and steady. 3 slow raps. Then nothing but by morning. Julia knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. Michael might not believe her, but the town knew something. They all did. She dressed quickly, left Emily in Michael's care, and walked straight into Crestwood with one goal in mind: finding the weathered man from the diner. It didn't take long. He was outside the post office, standing by the steps with his arms crossed, as though waiting for her. When their eyes met, Julia felt her throat go dry. She hadn't realized until that moment how badly she needed answers, and how much she feared hearing them. "You shouldn't be in that house," the man said before she could speak. His voice was low, gravelly, carrying the weight of something long unspoken. Julia forced herself to ask the question anyway. Why? What's inside the walls? The man's gaze shifted, scanning the street, making sure no one was close enough to hear. Then he leaned forward and said, "It's not what's inside the walls that you should fear. It's what the house lets in." His words sent a chill racing through Julia's spine. For the first time, she realized the house wasn't just old or haunted, it was hungry. The man led Julia away from the post office, down a narrow side street that wound behind the town's shuttered buildings. He moved with slow, deliberate steps, his boots crunching on loose gravel. "They won't talk to you," he muttered. "Not here. They don't like to stir things up." Julia hurried after him, her pulse racing. "Then tell me, please. My daughter," she says. It whispers to her. She sees him by the fence. Her voice cracked. "She said he's already inside." The man stopped abruptly, turning to face her. His eyes, pale and hard as stone, narrowed. If she hears it, then it's chosen her. That house doesn't bother with everyone. Only the ones it thinks it can keep. Julia's chest tightened. "What do you mean, keep?" The man looked past her, scanning the street again, then sighed as though the weight of years pressed down on him. "Families have lived there before. Never long. They leave quick, if they can. Some don't. Some disappear." He went on, his voice low. "The house wasn't built for living. Not really. It was raised on land that should have been left alone. Folks around here knew better, but the builder didn't care. They say he dug up something he shouldn't have. Bones, old bones, from a time before Crestwood. He built right over it. From the first day, things weren't right. Doors opening on their own, voices in the night, animals found dead in the yard. And the walls," his voice faltered, then hardened. "The walls have always whispered." That Julia's blood ran cold. Why didn't anyone tear it down? Why let families move in? The man's expression darkened. "Because it doesn't let go that easy. Folks tried once, tore half the place down before men started dropping. One fell from the roof, broke his neck. Another was crushed under a beam. The rest refused to go back. And the ones who live in it now." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "They leave, and sometimes the house follows. It finds ways." Julia staggered back, her breath coming shallow and quick. The man's words sank into her like ice, and for the first time she felt the full scope of her mistake. Moving her family here, setting foot in that place. She whispered, almost to herself, "What do I do?" The man held her gaze with grim finality. "You don't stay? Not if you love your child. Get out while you still can." His words echoed in her head as she walked back toward the house, dread gnawing at her. But when she reached the gravel path and saw Emily waiting in the upstairs window, waving with a smile that didn't quite look like hers, Julia realized with a hollow certainty, it might already be too late. Julia spent the rest of the day pacing the house, torn between action and paralysis. The man's warning echoed in her mind, "Don't stay. Not if you love your child." But every time she looked at Emily, she felt a creeping uncertainty. Her daughter seemed different, quieter, as though listening to something Julia could not hear. Sometimes she caught Emily glancing at the walls with a faint smile, her lips moving in soundless words. It chilled Julia to the bone. She knew then that if they were going to leave, it had to be tonight. She waited until Michael fell asleep. He still dismissed her fears, insisting that leaving now, so soon after the move, would be running from shadows. Julia didn't care. Shadows or not, she had seen enough. At midnight, she crept into Emily's room, packed a small bag with her daughter's clothes, and shook her awake. "Sweetheart, we're going for a drive," Julia whispered. Emily's eyes fluttered open, but instead of confusion, there was a strange calmness in her expression. "He said we wouldn't get far," Emily murmured. Julia froze, then forced a smile. "We'll prove him wrong." They made it down the stairs without waking Michael. Julia grabbed the car keys and opened the front door. The night air was cool, heavy with dew, and the gravel crunched under her shoes as she hurried Emily toward the car. But the moment she clicked the key fob, a loud bang echoed from inside the house, a door slamming shut. Julia whipped around. Every light in the house had flickered on at once, blazing through the windows like watchful eyes. And then she heard it. The creak of footsteps racing across the upstairs floorboards. Too fast, too heavy to belong to Michael or Emily. Panic surged through her. Julia shoved Emily into the car and fumbled with the keys, her hands slick with sweat. The engine sputtered, caught, and roared to life. She backed down the gravel drive, tires spitting stones into the darkness. But when the headlights swept across the fence line, her blood ran cold. The weathered man stood there again, but this time he wasn't alone. Dozens of figures lined the trees, silent, rigid shapes watching from the shadows. Their faces were indistinct, blurred by the night. But Julia felt their collective gaze like a weight pressing on her chest. She slammed her foot on the gas, heart pounding. But as the car lurched forward, Emily let out a scream. Julia glanced over, and her daughter was clawing at the window, crying, "He's inside! He's inside!" Julia's head snapped toward the rearview mirror. For the briefest second, she saw it. A pale face grinning from the back seat, its eyes hollow and endless. She swerved violently, the car skidding onto the empty road that wound out of Crestwood. Somewhere behind her, the house's lights flickered out all at once, leaving the town cloaked in darkness. But Julia knew whatever was inside those walls was now with them. Julia drove like a woman possessed, the dark road twisting through the woods as though trying to trap her. Branches arched overhead, clawing against the roof as the car sped forward. Emily sobbed in the back seat, clutching her stuffed rabbit, her eyes fixed on something Julia couldn't see. "Don't look at it, baby," Julia whispered, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Every so often, she glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that pale, grinning face staring back. Each time she saw only the darkened seats. Yet the air inside the car felt too full, too heavy, as if someone else were breathing with them. They reached the outskirts of Crestwood, where the trees gave way to open fields and a weathered sign read, "Thank you for visiting." Relief flickered in Julia's chest. She pressed the accelerator harder, eager to see the highway. But just as the road curved, the headlights cut across something that made her stomach drop. It was their house, standing alone at the bend, impossibly out of place, its white paint peeling, its broken shutters rattling in the night air. Julia slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. Emily wailed. Somehow, they hadn't escaped at all. The house had come with them. Panic clawed at Julia's throat. She threw the car into reverse, spun it around, and drove the other way. 10 minutes later, another bend, another clearing, and there it was again. The same house. Its dark windows gleamed in the headlights like open eyes. Julia screamed, pounding the steering wheel. "You can't have her. You can't have us." The words were swallowed by the night. Emily whispered from the back seat. "It said we belong to it now." In desperation, Julia pulled the car onto the shoulder and stumbled out, dragging Emily with her. The fields around them stretched endlessly, but no matter which way Julia turned, the silhouette of the house loomed in the distance, shifting closer with each blink. She dropped to her knees, clutching her daughter, sobbing. Then, silence. A silence so total that Julia realized even Emily had gone still. She looked down and saw her daughter's wide eyes staring up at her, unblinking. Slowly, With unnatural stiffness, Emily raised her hand and pointed toward the dark shape of the house. Julia's scream tore into the night as the ground beneath her trembled, the air thick with whispers rushing from every direction. She held Emily tighter, desperate, but her daughter's small body grew colder in her arms. The last thing Julia saw before the world went black was the house, impossibly close now, its doorway yawning open as if it had been waiting for her all along. When morning came, Crestwood was quiet. The house on the edge of town stood as it always had, silent and watching, ready for the next family. For in Crestwood, the house does not lose what it keeps.